A courthouse hallway, buzzing lights, cold stares. She walks in no heels, no briefcase, no need to impress. Just a worn coat, tired eyes, and a silence stronger than noise. They see what they want to see, someone who doesn't belong. But they're wrong. She's not here to perform. She's here because two children still believe she will never walk away. The lawyers speak in polished sentences. The judge glances over paperwork, but when he reaches the last page of her file, his breath catches. Because what he finds isn't a report, it's a reckoning. The woman they underestimated was never trying to win. She came to protect, and that changes everything. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Tell us below. The sun hadn't quite broken through the gray layer of morning haze when Daniela Green stepped out of her battered hatchback parked unevenly beside the gravel path leading to the courthouse. Her boots worn soft at the soles, pressed into the dirt with the steady rhythm of someone who had been on her feet far too long. The wind carried with it the sharp scent of pine mixed with faint diesel fumes from a passing maintenance truck, and as she pulled her coat tighter, a loose thread caught on the corner of her seatbelt and trailed behind her like a quiet reminder of everything unfinished. Her hair, twisted into a tight bun at the nape of her neck, was still damp from the rushed rinse she'd managed at the shelter bathroom hours earlier. Inside her chest, a familiar tension curled itself into place. Not panic, not fear exactly, but that thin wire pressure of knowing she'd be judged before she even opened her mouth. The courthouse loomed ahead, not grand but old, its beige stucco facade stained with time and bureaucracy. The flag above the doorway flapped lazily, half-heartedly, as if even it was tired of watching. As Daniela stepped through the glass doors, the scent changed industrial lemon cleaner mixed with paper dust and the metallic tang of distrust. She walked with purpose, but each step felt like moving through molasses, slowed by the weight of what she carried that no one else could see. At the reception window, a young woman in a pale blouse didn't look up when she spoke. Check-ins for court appearances are on the left. Legal counsel, please proceed to room 2B. Daniela cleared her throat, her voice even but quiet. I'm here on behalf of the children. Green Child Protective Services. That made the woman pause briefly, flicking her gaze upward to scan Daniela's clothes. Jeans still dusty at the knees, a field jacket stained at the cuff, and beneath that, the corner of a hospital wristband still clinging to her forearm from earlier. She didn't say anything, just pointed toward the hallway. Family Court. Room 2B. No thank you, no welcome, just the kind of dismissal reserved for people who didn't dress the part. The corridor stretched ahead in cold tile and low murmurs. Conversations hushed. As she passed, people glanced quickly, looked away, and then looked again, as if unsure where to place her in their mental caste system. She wasn't a lawyer, wasn't in heels, wasn't clean in the way they liked clean to look. One man muttered to his colleague, "Is she the aunt?" followed by a stifled chuckle. Daniela kept walking. She had learned a long time ago that silence could be armor when wielded right. Her file was tucked under one arm, the edges creased from the storm that morning, and with each step her jaw tightened, not in anger, but in preparation. Room 2B was already full. A judge's voice echoed faintly through the door, and behind it papers shuffled, heels clicked, lives were being decided. Daniela took a moment at the door, her fingers tightening around the handle before pushing it open. The courtroom was modest. Rows of wooden benches lined the space, the seal of the county carved above the bench. Where Judge Bainbridge sat, his white hair neatly combed, his robe, pressed, his eyes sharp and scanning. The second he saw her, his posture changed just barely, but it was there. A flicker of skepticism, maybe irritation, passed across his face, like a shadow shifting with the sun. She moved to the table assigned to state representatives and placed her file down with careful precision. Her fingers lingered at the edge of the folder before retreating. Bainbridge leaned forward, narrowing his eyes slightly, and said in a voice loud enough for the gallery to hear, "Miss Green, I assume you understand this is a courtroom, not a crisis shelter." A few people smirked. One woman covered her mouth to hide a grin. Daniela didn't flinch. She raised her chin just enough and replied, "Yes, Your Honor. I came straight from a placement call. There wasn't time to change." Her voice didn't waver, but the weariness beneath it carried the weight of long nights and longer silences. The judge didn't respond immediately, only glanced down at his notes, tapping a pen against the edge of the bench like a metronome marking judgment. "Well," he muttered, "let's try to maintain some standard of decorum moving forward." His words were polite, but his tone sharpened each syllable like it wanted to draw blood. Daniela nodded once, said nothing more. She didn't need to explain the early morning emergency, the child with bruises too old to be recent and too recent to ignore, or the grandmother who finally said, "Enough." She didn't need to tell them about the broken lock, the smell of rot in the trailer, the child's trembling fingers when she reached for Daniela's coat and whispered, "Can I come with you?" Instead, she stood there now, surrounded by polished shoes and pressed suits, her clothes out of place, her presence barely tolerated. But her eyes stayed focused, not on the judge, not on the smirking attorney across the aisle, but on the worn bench where a 14-year-old boy would soon sit, hoping that someone, anyone, might listen to his voice without measuring his worth by the look of the person who showed up for him. Daniela exhaled slowly, quietly, like someone used to waiting for fairness that seldom arrived on time. But she was here, and that at least for today would have to be enough. The second Daniela took her seat, the room seemed to exhale its discomfort like steam from a kettle too long on the stove, the kind of subtle release that doesn't announce itself out loud but is felt in glances, shifting postures, and the tightening corners of mouths, trying hard not to smirk. She placed her hands on her lap, fingers interlaced in quiet discipline, her file sitting unopened in front of her like a student waiting for permission to speak. Across the aisle, a man in a navy suit adjusted his tie with the casual precision of someone used to being listened to, the kind of confidence that wasn't loud but was undeniably rehearsed. Richard Valen, counsel for the petitioner, glanced briefly at Daniela, his eyes sweeping over her with the dispassion of a hotel manager judging a guest's luggage before assigning them a room. The judge cleared his throat, not loudly, but with that theatrical cadence meant to command attention without needing to raise his voice. "Mr. Valen," he said, leaning back slightly in his chair, "I assume your client is prepared to proceed." Valen gave a practiced nod and stood smoothing the front of his blazer like he was preparing to walk on stage rather than into a custody hearing. "Indeed, Your Honor," he replied, turning toward the gallery for a moment before speaking again, his voice calm but laced with a subtle rhythm of superiority. "My client, Miss Ellen Whitaker, is ready and fully prepared to assume guardianship responsibilities for the minor children in question. She has a stable income, a home environment deemed appropriate by child services, and a strong support system rooted in family and faith." Daniela didn't move, didn't react, didn't blink. She knew this script. She had heard variations of it in rooms like this all across the county, words wrapped in polish and politeness, used to tip the scales before the facts even got a chance to stand up straight. And as Your Honor can see, Valen continued, now gesturing slightly in Daniela's direction, the state representative assigned to this case has arrived without proper preparation or, frankly, the appropriate respect for this court. He let the words linger in the air just long enough to draw attention without needing to explain them further. "One would hope," he added lightly, "that in matters as serious as child custody appearances would reflect the gravity of the responsibility." The words didn't sting so much as they settled like fine dust in the corners of a room no one thought needed cleaning. Daniela looked straight ahead, her posture unchanged, but a slow breath moved through her chest, one that she didn't release too quickly, afraid it might sound like exasperation. In her head, she traced back the last 24 hours, trying to find a moment when she could have done something differently. Maybe she could have gone home and changed clothes after leaving the ER. Maybe she could have skipped the shelter stop and handed the little girl off to another worker. Maybe she could have slept an hour instead of none. But every maybe came with a cost, one she wasn't willing to pass off on someone else. Judge Bainbridge folded his hands on the bench, his fingers pale at the knuckles, his ring tapping lightly against the edge of a legal pad as he examined Daniela again. "Miss Green," he said, his voice measured but cool, "I assume you have reviewed the details of the petitioner's file." Daniela nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." "And do you contest the suitability of Miss Whitaker to provide care?" he asked. Daniela hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she knew how it would be received. "Her home is stable," Daniela said carefully, "but the emotional needs of the children require more than routine. They require familiarity, consistency, and someone who's earned their trust." The judge's brow twitched almost imperceptibly. "That's a subjective assessment," he replied. This court values objective criteria. Daniela's voice didn't rise, but it deepened slightly, like a slow current pulling underneath calm water. With respect, Your Honor, trust is often the difference between a child surviving and a child healing. These children have lived through more than paperwork can capture. They know who's shown up and who hasn't. There was a pause, not long, but heavy enough to shift the room's temperature. Valen's lips pressed into a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and the judge leaned back, steepling his fingers in front of his chin, as if evaluating a riddle rather than a person. Behind Daniela, someone coughed. A baby cried faintly from a bench near the back. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a dull mechanical drone that made even stillness feel noisy. Daniela didn't turn. She stayed, seated, her spine straight, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on nothing and everything. She didn't need them to see her pain, just her presence. That alone had cost enough. She thought about Devon waiting somewhere outside, probably pacing, probably nervous, holding on to hope like it was something that might slip through his fingers if he didn't grip tight enough. She thought about his sister asleep on the ride to the shelter, her hand never letting go of Daniela's coat sleeve, whispering in her sleep, "Don't let them split us up." She thought about all the mornings she arrived too early and stayed too late, not because it was in her job description, but because she'd once been a child herself in a room like this, waiting for someone who never came. The judge glanced at the clock. "We'll resume testimony after a brief recess," he said, voice clipped, emotionless, already reaching for his gavel. Daniela stood slowly, gathering her file with careful hands, and when she turned to exit she caught Valen's eye just long enough to see the amusement flicker across his face like a shadow passing over glass. He didn't need to speak. The message was clear. He thought the performance was over before it had begun, but what he didn't understand, what none of them seemed to understand, was that Daniela had never come to perform. She had come to endure, to stand, to stay. Not because it looked good, not because it earned applause, but because two children were depending on her to hold the line when no one else would. And she wasn't about to move. When the judge's gavel finally came down to signal the recess, the sound wasn't sharp or dramatic, just a dull wooden tap that echoed briefly before fading into the low rustle of papers and quiet shuffling of footsteps. Daniela didn't move at first. She stayed seated as people around her rose with a sense of urgency or boredom, depending on their roles, their shoes, clicking across the linoleum, in uneven rhythm like raindrops on a broken roof. She looked down at her hands, resting on the thin manila file, the edges curled slightly from being held too long, her knuckles pale, her fingertips dry from the constant hand-washing that came with her work. She took a slow breath, trying not to let it shake on the way out, and when she finally stood, it was with the weight of everything unsaid still pressing against her chest. The hallway outside the courtroom was colder than she remembered, maybe because the air conditioning was working overtime, or maybe because her body had finally registered how exhausted it really was. People passed her without looking, lawyers checking phones, parents whispering anxiously, court officers speaking in clipped tones through walkie-talkies. No one said a word to her. She moved toward the bench by the vending machines, one of the only quiet corners she knew from too many days spent waiting in places where she wasn't quite welcome but always had to be. As she sat, she loosened her shoulders just slightly, not enough to call it relief, just enough to remind her that she still had control over something. A woman in a dark suit passed by, paused just a second, then kept going, her expression unreadable. Daniela noticed the way people's eyes lingered on her clothes, not the way they did on a homeless person, not with pity, but with suspicion, like they couldn't quite decide if she was staff or if she'd wandered in by mistake. She had long ago learned to read that look, the one that searched for a badge, a title, a visible reason to treat someone with decency. And when it wasn't visible, decency became optional. "Ma'am," a voice said, low and firm, and she looked up to see a uniformed guard standing just a few feet away. He was white, stocky, probably in his early 50s, with a heavy utility belt and a face that had long since learned how to stay expressionless. "This area's reserved for legal personnel and family only." His tone wasn't harsh, but it wasn't kind either, just efficient, like he'd said this sentence 100 times before and didn't plan on explaining it today. Daniela nodded once calmly. "I'm with Child Protective Services." "Green," she said, reaching for her ID badge that had slipped behind her coat collar. He barely glanced at it before repeating, "Still need you to find another place to wait. We've had issues before, don't want anyone loitering." The word landed like a slap, not because it was shouted, but because it was familiar, too familiar. Loitering was the word used when someone who looked like her stood still too long in the wrong place, the word that didn't need to accuse her of anything specific to make her feel like she didn't belong. Daniela didn't argue. She had learned long ago that arguments only confirmed what people were already looking for. She stood without a word, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and moved toward the opposite wall, near a dusty bulletin board no one had looked at in years. Her back rested gently against the cold plaster as she stared down at her boots, the dried mud from the trailer park still clinging to the soles like a secret no one wanted to hear. She could still hear the boy's voice from that morning, Devon 14, trying to sound older than he was trying not to cry, when he asked her if it was okay to hope. "They said we might be split up," he whispered. "But you said you'd fight for us." And she had nodded firmly because the one thing she never did was make promises she couldn't keep. That's why she'd shown up in court like this, no time to change, no time to explain, just time to act. Because trust once earned from a child who had learned to trust no one was not something you took lightly. Across the hallway, someone laughed sharp, careless, the kind of laugh people do when they know no one's listening closely. A young intern may be chatting with a colleague about their weekend plans. Daniela let the sound pass through her, not because she was immune to it, but because she had too much else inside her to make room for that kind of noise. She glanced at the clock on the far wall, the minute hand crawling toward the hour, like it too was reluctant to return to the courtroom. Time had a strange way of moving in places like this, fast when you were losing slow, when you were waiting to be heard. Behind her eyelids she could still see the children's faces, Devon's quiet determination, his sister's wide eyes full of questions she hadn't learned how to ask yet. They weren't just names in a file. They weren't a case number or a statistic or a line item in someone's quarterly report. They were lives soft, complicated, unfinished, and today they were depending on her to be louder than the silence, stronger than the assumptions, and steadier than the system that too often failed to see what really mattered. So she stood there in that hallway alone, but not invisible, tired but not defeated, knowing that the next time she walked through that courtroom door she wouldn't be asking for validation, she'd be demanding truth. The call had come in just after 5 in the morning, the kind that slipped through the static like a whisper wrapped in urgency, and Daniela answered it before the second ring, already half-dressed and seated on the edge of her couch, with a coffee gone cold on the table beside her. Her voice, low and steady, betrayed nothing of the exhaustion still clinging to her limbs. "Green," she said, and the dispatcher wasted no time. "Anonymous tip. Child in danger. Rural trailer lot off Route 6. Neighbor says screaming started around 3 a.m. and hasn't stopped." Daniela didn't ask questions, there was no point. She'd learned a long time ago that truth in these calls rarely came clean. She stood, grabbed her bag, and pulled her jacket over her t-shirt still damp from last night's rain. She didn't bother tying her boots, she just shoved her feet in, locked the door behind her, and drove. The sun was still crouched behind the hills when she pulled up to the lot, a patch of cracked dirt and rusted metal scattered with makeshift homes and old tires. The place looked like it had stopped trying years ago, and the air smelled of oil, wet wood, and something sharper, maybe vinegar, maybe despair. Her tires crunched against the gravel, and a porch light flicked off the second she stepped out, as if her presence had tripped a wire no one wanted lit. She approached slowly, scanning each trailer for signs of life, eyes adjusting to the faint glow of morning seeping over the horizon. Then she heard a muffled cry, too soft to place, followed by a loud bang, then silence so sudden it made her stop mid-step. That silence was what she trusted most. Not the noise, not the words people said, but the absence of sound that always meant something had broken. She quickened her pace, following the noise to a narrow trailer with peeling paint and duct tape across one window, the door ajar just enough to say, "Don't come in," without the words. She didn't knock. She never knocked in places like this. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, like it had been breathed too many times without being let out. The floor sagged under her boots as she stepped inside, calling softly, "Hello, my name's Daniela. I'm with Child Services." No answer came, but there was a rustle from the back room, followed by a sharp intake of breath like someone trying not to be heard. She moved carefully, one foot after the other, keeping her voice even. "I'm not here to take anybody by force. I just want to make sure everyone's okay." In the corner of a small, dim bedroom, curled behind a broken dresser and a pile of dirty laundry, was a girl, no older than 7, her cheeks streaked with dirt and dried tears, her left arm cradled against her chest in a way that told Daniela it had stopped hurting hours ago, and that was probably the worst part. The girl didn't scream or flinch. She just looked up with those wide, flat eyes that had already seen too much, eyes that didn't beg for help, only confirmation that help wouldn't make things worse. Daniela crouched down slowly, arms loose at her sides, not reaching yet, not rushing, letting the girl breathe through the fear. "Is it just you here?" Daniela asked softly, and after a long pause the girl shook her head. "My brother," she whispered. "He's outside. He told me to hide." Daniela's heart caught for a moment, not in panic but in preparation. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the emergency snack she kept for kids who hadn't eaten yet that day, and offered it gently. "I'm going to get you both out of here, okay? We're not going to wait for things to get worse." As she scooped the girl into her arms, careful not to touch the bruised spots, the front door creaked louder than it should have, and a boy appeared, barely a teenager, hair-matted fists clenched, standing like a sentry who didn't know whether to attack or run. "Don't take her," he said, voice shaking but fierce. Daniela didn't scold him, didn't use her badge as a shield. "I'm not here to break you apart," she said. "I'm here because you've done more protecting than you should have had to, and now someone needs to protect you." The boy didn't answer right away, but after a few long seconds he nodded once, just once, and then walked to the back of the trailer to grab a small backpack worn and too light to hold much more than survival. As they left the trailer, Daniela's phone buzzed with a text from the shelter, "One bed available, intake open until 7. She texted back, quickly confirmed the slot, and pulled open the passenger door for the boy. "You hungry?" she asked as she started the engine. He shrugged, eyes out the window. "A little," he said. "But she's worse. She hasn't eaten since yesterday." On the drive back, the girl fell asleep in Daniela's lap, her head tucked under Daniela's chin, and the boy stayed silent, eyes fixed on the road like he was memorizing every tree, every light post, in case someone asked him to prove later that this had actually happened. Daniela didn't speak much either. There wasn't anything to say that would make it easier. Instead, she kept one hand on the wheel and the other gently curled around the girl's shoulder, and when they reached the shelter, she carried her in without hesitation, cradling her like something precious that needed repair, not rescue. After the intake paperwork was signed and the children were tucked into temporary beds, Daniela stepped into the small staff bathroom, washed her hands slowly, and stared at herself in the mirror. Dirt on her face, blood on her sleeve not hers, and a smear of something she couldn't quite place on her jacket collar. She thought briefly of stopping home to change before court, but when she looked at the time, it was already too late. She was due in front of Judge Bainbridge in less than an hour, and nothing about her appearance said professional by his standards. Still, she grabbed a clean towel from the rack, wiped the worst of the mess from her clothes, and pulled her hair back tight again. In the mirror, she didn't see a woman falling apart. She saw someone holding everything together with frayed string and bare hands. Someone who didn't get to show up, polished but always showed up. She took one last breath, turned out the light, and walked back to her car, already thinking about how she would explain all this to a courtroom that didn't want to hear it. When the courtroom resumed after recess, the air felt subtly different, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves had soaked in the earlier tension and were now reluctant to release it. Daniela stepped back inside with quiet composure, her hands folded around her file like a shield, not made of metal but of memory and stubborn grace. The judge had returned to his bench, unreadable behind a pair of thin spectacles that rested low on his nose, scanning the papers before him with the kind of detachment that comes from years of seeing too many people and hearing too few truths. Across the room, Richard Vallon sat poised and confident, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, as if the outcome had already been drafted before anyone spoke a word. The bailiff called the court to order, his voice clipped and routine, and Judge Bainbridge gestured for Vallon to proceed. He stood slowly, like a man accustomed to being watched, his step smooth, his suit uncreased, every movement deliberate and practiced. Your Honor, he began with that polished tone that made everything sound reasonable, even when it wasn't. Before we continue with the testimony from CPS, I'd like to reintroduce the petitioner, Miss Ellen Whitaker, and briefly review her qualifications to assume permanent guardianship of the minors in question. Daniela didn't react. She had expected this part. She had seen this tactic used before many times. Start with the narrative of stability, present it like fact, and let the room fill in the rest with imagination and bias. Ellen stood at the prompt, a woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked blonde hair pulled back into a French twist, her beige pantsuit crisp, her blouse cream-colored, and buttoned all the way to the collar. She offered a polite nod to the judge and folded her hands in front of her with the ease of someone who had never entered a courtroom feeling unwelcome. Valen continued outlining her credentials with the rhythm of a commercial retired school administrator, longtime homeowner, in a suburban neighborhood, active church volunteer, and he emphasized with care, a woman with no prior involvement in the foster system but deeply committed to providing a stable moral home. Daniela listened closely, not because she doubted the woman's sincerity, but because she understood how easily comfort could be mistaken for competence. Ellen may have meant well, but meaning well didn't raise children through trauma. It didn't explain the sleepless nights, the way Devon flinched at sudden sounds, or how his sisters still froze in hallways if the lights flickered too long. Those things didn't show up in paperwork or polite smiles. They showed up when trust was tested, and someone chose to stay anyway. Valen's voice took on a softer lilt, now guiding the courtroom toward a conclusion before they'd even heard the counterpoint. The children would have their own rooms, a private backyard, access to quality schools, and most importantly, a maternal figure with deep roots in the community. He paused just long enough to let the picture settle in everyone's minds. A clean kitchen, warm meals, a tidy life wrapped in safety and Sunday morning light. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, which I might add is quite a contrast to the circumstances in which they were recently found. That sentence, so carefully chosen, so seemingly objective, was designed to burn slowly, to let implication do the work that accusation no longer needed to. Daniela's chest tightened not in anger, but in restraint. She could feel every eye in the room shift slightly toward her, as if confirming that yes, this woman with dirt still faintly on her boots couldn't possibly offer the same kind of sanctuary. She didn't look at the judge. She didn't look at Valen. Instead, she looked down at her file and imagined the trembling hands of the little girl she had carried that morning, the soft voice that had whispered, "Don't leave me." That voice mattered more than the quiet judgment humming through the courtroom walls. Judge Bainbridge raised an eyebrow. "And has Miss Whitaker previously interacted with the children?" he asked, his voice cool, factual. "She has met them once," Valen responded smoothly. "It was brief, but she made a strong impression. The boy Devon even thanked her for the cookies." Daniela closed her eyes for half a second, not because of the cookies, but because of how often people mistook gratitude for consent, as if politeness was proof of preference. She'd seen kids smile to survive, say thank you when they were terrified, nod their heads when their stomachs turned, because trauma teaches you to be agreeable if it means safety. As Valen returned to his seat, Ellen offered a soft smile toward the judge, and for a moment the room seemed to lean toward her, not because of malice, but because people are drawn to neatness, to what feels familiar, quiet, contained. Daniela knew she wouldn't win this moment by speaking louder or dressing better. She would have to win it by being undeniable, by presenting something the court couldn't ignore, even if it didn't fit their frame. And so she reached for her file, slowly unfolding it on the table, not to counter Ellen's life, but to illuminate the children's plaint, because this wasn't about which adult seemed more put together, it was about which one had shown up when no one else did, who had listened without judgment, who had sat in the dark with a child until the shaking stopped. And that kind of care wasn't clean or photogenic, it was raw and messy and real, and Daniela had brought all of it into that room whether they wanted to see it or not. During the next recess, Daniela stepped into the hallway again, her file clutched loosely in one hand, her fingertips stiff from holding it too long, and her shoulders carrying the kind of tension that doesn't come from weight, but from the quiet exhaustion of being constantly measured by the wrong metrics. The air outside the courtroom felt heavier than it had earlier, though nothing had changed except how long she'd been breathing it. People moved past her in pairs and small clusters, some nodding politely to each other, others scrolling their phones, laughing at something shared just between them. No one looked at her directly. Not really. Not like she was part of the same world they moved through without friction. She found herself drawn back to the bench near the vending machines, not because it was comfortable, but because it was out of the way, tucked behind an old bulletin board, still pinned with outdated flyers for parenting classes and mediation, workshops that never had enough seats. She sat slowly, resting her elbows on her knees, letting the weight in her spine uncoil just enough to remember how much her body had been carrying. She didn't close her eyes. Not here. Not in a place where closing your eyes meant letting down your guard. Instead, she stared at the scuffed tile floor beneath her boots, tracing the same cracked line between two squares, like it might somehow lead her to an answer. That's when she felt it again, that shift in attention, that subtle pull of eyes that don't meet yours, but linger just long enough to remind you you're being watched. A man in a courthouse security uniform was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, radio clipped to his shoulder, watching her with the polite suspicion reserved for people who don't look like they belong. "Ma'am," he said flatly, his voice practiced and just loud enough to be heard by everyone nearby. "This section is for court personnel and families only." Daniela glanced behind her at the empty benches, then looked back at him, her voice even. "I'm with Child Protective Services," she said, reaching again for her badge. The guard didn't reach for the badge. He didn't even lean closer to read it. He just said, "We've had complaints about loitering in this area before. I'm going to need you to wait somewhere else." And there it was again, not anger, not even hostility, just the cold detachment of someone following rules that only seemed to apply to certain people in certain clothes. Daniela didn't argue. She knew better. She stood, adjusted her coat, and walked without another word toward the far end of the hallway, where the lights flickered just slightly above the intake counter and no one bothered to wipe down the benches anymore. Behind her, two women in business suits continued their conversation uninterrupted. One of them gave her a quick glance, then looked away like she'd just passed by a forgotten umbrella. Daniela stood near the wall and took another breath, not to calm down, but to steady herself against the familiar rhythm of being dismissed. It didn't shock her anymore. It didn't even sting the way it used to. But it still took something, still chipped away at the quiet dignity she worked so hard to carry through spaces that never invited it in the first place. She checked her watch. Still 20 minutes until the court reconvened. She thought about going outside for air, but knew she'd only be stopped again, questioned again, asked again to prove her right to be here. Instead, she leaned against the wall and reached into her coat pocket, pulling out the photograph she kept folded behind her phone. Devin and his sister smiling through cracked teeth and mismatched clothes, arms wrapped around each other like they were holding the whole world together. She stared at it, not for strength, not even for comfort, but as a reminder that everything about this fight mattered, not because of how it looked, but because of what it protected. A younger security guard passed by, barely out of his 20s, his eyes flicking toward her badge, before landing on the stain still faintly visible near her jacket sleeve. He muttered something under his breath, looks more like maintenance than CPS, and walked on like he hadn't said a thing. Daniela didn't respond. She didn't flinch. But somewhere in her chest something shifted, not in anger but in resolve. Because if they couldn't see who she was by now, then maybe they weren't meant to. Maybe the point wasn't to convince them at all. Her phone buzzed. A message from the shelter. "The girl's asking when you'll be back." Daniela smiled faintly, her thumb brushing over the screen, not typing yet, just holding that little moment like a thread tying her to something real. She typed back, "Tell her soon, and remind her I always keep my promises." She slipped the phone back into her coat and stood taller, her back no longer against the wall, but aligned with the part of herself that had never wavered, not even in rooms built to make her feel smaller. The hallway lights buzzed above her, and the doors to the courtroom clicked open down the corridor. Daniela turned toward them, her steps deliberate, her hands steady, and for the first time that day she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she carried, not as a burden but as proof. Proof that even in places where she was pushed to the margins, she remained unmoved, unshaken, and entirely present, because that's what the children saw. And their belief, unlike the court's, didn't need credentials, it only needed truth. Back inside his chambers, Judge Bainbridge sat alone, the door shut tight behind him, and the noise of the hallway reduced to a faint pulsing murmur that couldn't quite reach through the heavy oak. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose slow and deliberate, not because he was tired, but because something beneath his carefully maintained certainty had started to shift, and he hadn't yet decided what to do about it. The file in front of him lay open but unread pages, slightly curled at the edges marked with yellow highlighter and paper clips that suggested someone had tried to impose order on a story that refused to be contained. His hand hovered over it, not with hesitation exactly, but with the kind of guarded curiosity a man feels when he suspects he's been wrong for a very long time. He let out a long breath, the kind that filled the room but didn't lighten it, then stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back, his black robe brushing quietly against the floor like the whisper of a memory he'd tried too hard to forget. Outside, the courthouse lawn was mostly empty, just a few pigeons circling a cracked stone fountain, and a teenage boy leaning against a parking sign kicking gravel with the toe of his sneaker. The judge didn't know the boy's name, didn't need to. He recognized the posture, waiting unsure, bracing for news from a world that rarely delivered good ones. Behind him, the hum of the office's fluorescent lights flickered like a thought trying to form. He turned back to the desk and sat slowly reaching for the top sheet of the file. Daniela Green's CPS. Her photo clipped to the corner, not a professional headshot, just a standard ID image, direct gaze, dark eyes, jaw set. It wasn't a face that invited sympathy, but neither did it ask for it. It was the face of a woman who'd stopped explaining herself a long time ago. He studied it, not looking for anything specific, just trying to place what it was about her that had unsettled him so deeply in that courtroom. It hadn't been her voice. Her voice had been calm, firm, unshaken. It wasn't her arguments either. He'd heard better. He'd heard worse. No, it was the way she stood, not defensive, not meek, but grounded, like someone who had already been judged and decided it didn't matter. That kind of presence wasn't learned in law school or taught in family court. It came from somewhere else, somewhere harder. He flipped the page. Performance reviews, field reports, letters from teachers, therapists, shelter workers, all threaded with the same theme. Relentless, dependable, sometimes difficult, never absent. She showed up, even when it was easier not to, even when she wasn't welcomed. His eyes skimmed the margins, notes scrawled in ink from people who had worked beside her. Takes the weekend shifts no one wants. Knows when to speak and when to just sit with a kid. Once drove 3 hours to find a foster sibling placement just so the brothers wouldn't be separated. The judge sat back and ran a hand over his chin, the stubble rasping beneath his fingertips. A small reminder of how much time had passed since he'd last been still long enough to feel his own face. In the silence, a memory crept in, uninvited but persistent, a courtroom from long ago. Not this one, not as polished, where he'd sat on the other side of the bench as a child, knees swinging beneath a wooden chair, too big for his frame. Father seated beside him, oil-stained collar, hands folded, eyes tired. He could still smell it, the thick scent of sweat and motor grease, clinging to a man who worked double shifts at the steel yard, and had shown up that day in his cleanest shirt, which still wasn't clean enough. The judge had been 8, maybe 9, and even then he could feel how the room looked at his father like a problem, like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed out. The judge had ruled against him, of course, said he lacked the proper presentation. Those were the words used. Not violence, not neglect, just not the right appearance. His mother had gotten custody. She'd done her best. But something in him had closed that day, something he hadn't known to name. Now, years later, seated in a room lined with plaques and framed degrees, Judge Bainbridge found himself wondering how many times he had done the same thing. Not out of cruelty, not even bias he could easily recognize, but something more insidious, habit, comfort, the quiet preference for people who came polished and stayed predictable. Daniela Green was neither. He looked down at the photo again. The stain on her coat sleeve, faint but visible, had annoyed him earlier. Now it sat there like a footnote that demanded to be read. Where had she come from that morning? What child had she pulled out of danger before walking into his courtroom, only to be scolded for not dressing the part? His intercom buzzed softly, and his clerk's voice came through. 10 minutes until reconvene, sir." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he flipped one more page and found a handwritten note from the child therapist assigned to Devon. It read simply, he calls her, the person who never left. Says it like it's a title, like it's sacred. The judge closed the file, not with dismissal, but with care, placing his hand on top of it as if to hold it there, keep it real, keep it close. The boy outside the window was still pacing. He thought of that title, the person who never left, and wondered how many children had given it to someone, and how few of those people had ever made it into the official records. He straightened his robe, and looked at himself in the small mirror above the coat rack. For the first time in years, he didn't look like a man entirely sure of himself. And maybe that was the point. Maybe today wasn't about certainty. Maybe it was about finally seeing. The courtroom was already full when Daniela returned. Though no one had spoken yet, there was only the soft shuffling of paper, the scrape of shoes against polished floor, and the faint, restless creak of wooden benches beneath the weight of waiting. The bailiff stood near the door, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room with bored efficiency while the judge hadn't taken his seat yet, though his nameplate stood quietly at the bench, polished and unmoving as if guarding a verdict not yet spoken. Daniela moved to her spot at the table without looking at anyone, her steps firm but not hurried, her shoulders set in that subtle tension that held more than fatigue. It held memory resistance and an unspoken refusal to bend. She hadn't even set her file down when the courtroom door creaked open again, this time more urgently, and the heads of half a dozen spectators turned instinctively toward the sound. A teenage boy stepped through the doorway, his posture uncertain but his steps sure, the kind of mix you only saw in someone who'd made a promise to be brave, even if no one else had asked him to be. His hoodie was too big, sleeves swallowed half his hands, and his shoes squeaked against the floor like they hadn't been worn inside a building this clean before. He didn't look toward Daniela, not right away. He walked straight up to the bailiff and said in a voice just barely loud enough to carry, "I need to speak. It's about me and her." Judge Bainbridge had just entered through the side door, his robe trailing behind him with practiced gravity, and he raised a hand before the bailiff could respond. "Come forward," the judge said, not warmly, not coldly, just with the kind of authority that left no space for hesitation. The boy took a breath, then moved down the center aisle, every eye in the room following him like he was carrying something invisible they were all trying to see. He stood at the front next to Daniela, now not touching her, not looking at her, but standing close enough that she felt the heat of his presence like a heartbeat beside her. The judge tilted his head. "Your name?" he asked. "Devon Thomas," the boy said, voice steadier now. "And the girl this hearing is about? She's my sister." A rustle moved through the room like wind through dry grass, polite surprise, barely masked assumptions, the sound of expectations being rearranged in real time. Devon glanced toward Ellen Whitaker, then the woman who had offered him cookies, the one smiling gently now with that expression adults wear when they're trying to be both comforting and persuasive. "She's nice," Devon said plainly, "but she's not who we know." The judge leaned forward slightly, elbows on the bench, fingers steepled. "And who do you know?" he asked. Devon looked at Daniela, then finally, his eyes tired but clear. "Her," he said. "Miss Green. She's the one who found us. She's the one who stayed." He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, the edges bent, the ink slightly smudged. "This is from me and my sister," he said. "I wrote it this morning while she was still asleep." He unfolded the paper with both hands, smoothing it against the table in front of him, then began to read, his voice quiet but steady. "Dear Judge, we don't know how this works, but we hope someone listens. We don't want to be somewhere that's just clean or safe. We want to be with someone who makes us feel okay inside. Miss Green didn't just take us out of that house. She held my sister when she was scared, and she let me ask hard questions without making me feel stupid. She didn't leave. Even when it was late, even when we cried, even when we said things we didn't mean because we were mad or afraid. She just stayed." There was no sound in the room now, not even the rustle of fabric or the faint tapping of pens. Daniela didn't move. She hadn't expected this, hadn't asked for it, hadn't known about it, and yet it felt like something inevitable had finally stepped into the light. Devon kept reading, his voice growing firmer. "You might think someone like her doesn't look like a regular mom, but to us, she's more than that. She's the person we trust. We don't want to start over. We already found where we feel safe." When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and held it out toward the bench. The bailiff took it and delivered it to the judge, who accepted it silently, his eyes scanning Devon for something he wasn't sure how to name. Then Bainbridge looked at Daniela, not with doubt this time, but with something more hesitant, more human. She met his gaze without blinking, not defiant, not triumphant, just present, as if to say, "I didn't bring him here, but I won't stop him from being heard." Ellen Whitaker shifted slightly in her seat, her smile fading just a fraction, her eyes landing not on Daniela or Devon, but somewhere, middle distance, perhaps understanding, perhaps not, that kindness and competence weren't the same connection. Valen leaned over and whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. Her hands rested gently in her lap, and for the first time that morning she looked unsure of her place in this story. Devon stepped back, then returning to the bench behind Daniela, where he sat with his hands clasped and his shoulders square, like someone who had done what needed to be done, and now waited without apology. Daniela reached behind her, not turning, just enough to rest her hand briefly over his. A small touch, a silent thank you. The kind that doesn't ask for more. And in that moment, the courtroom didn't feel like a courtroom. It felt like a pause in the usual machinery, a breath held in a space where too many words had been spoken without truth. Judge Bainbridge sat quietly for a long moment, his fingers brushing over the edge of the letter, and the silence held not awkward, not empty, but sacred, like something real had finally been said. Something that didn't need a gavel to make it matter. The letter sat quietly on the judge's desk, its folded edge casting a soft shadow across the oak surface, as if it were daring him to unfold, more than paper, daring him to unravel the comfort of procedure and lean into something harder to measure. Judge Bainbridge tapped his pen once lightly, almost unconsciously, then again, the rhythm uneven, like a thought trying to keep pace with a memory that wouldn't stay still. He hadn't spoken since Devon sat back down, hadn't even looked toward the council tables or the gallery, as though his mind had stepped into a different room altogether, one lined with truths he'd kept boxed away for too long. He finally reached for the file he'd been avoiding, the one labeled Green D, and opened it with a kind of quiet reverence, the way a man might open a letter from someone who had once seen him clearly. The first page was a summary report, clean, clinical, efficient, but it didn't hold his attention. His eyes drifted instead to the margins, where handwritten notes curled around the typed lines, small but unmistakably personal. One read, "Trusts built in hours, loyalty earned in days." Another, "Stayed past shift end, 4 nights this week. Child refused to sleep unless she was nearby." The judge's fingers rested there a moment, tracing the ink as though trying to feel the truth embedded in the strokes. He turned another page, a reference from a school counselor. "Daniela Green doesn't just file reports, she listens, she remembers birthdays, she advocates like it's her own blood on the line." The next from a foster parent, "She brings comfort in chaos. I once saw her crawl under a kitchen table just to coax a 5-year-old out from a panic spiral, and she stayed there with him for 2 hours, humming." Bainbridge leaned back slightly, his spine stiff, but his gaze softening as if each line peeled away another layer of certainty he'd mistaken for wisdom. Across the room, Daniela remained still, her posture calm but alert, as if she could sense the shift even without seeing it. She didn't move to speak, didn't press her case. She simply waited, letting the room fill with something rarely present in courtrooms, truth that didn't demand attention but simply existed, undeniable in its quiet weight. The judge glanced at her again this time, without the veil of skepticism, and then down at a photograph clipped to the back of the file. It was slightly faded, printed in a rush, but it captured a moment of unfiltered tenderness. Daniela kneeling beside Devon and his sister, a paper crown on the girl's head, laughter frozen mid-breath. He cleared his throat, the sound small and almost reluctant, then turned to Valen, who sat rigid and unreadable, his lips pressed in a line so tight it seemed etched in stone. "Counsel," the judge said, voice even but slower than before, "are there any additional documents you believe the court should consider before moving to final recommendations?" Valen straightened his spine, then shook his head. "No, Your Honor," he replied, his tone professional but less sure than earlier, like he too had begun to feel the current shifting beneath the floor. Judge Bainbridge nodded, then returned his attention to Daniela, his eyes settling on her, not like a question, but like someone finally choosing to listen. "Miss," "Green," he said quietly, "you've remained notably silent throughout most of these proceedings. Was that intentional?" Daniela lifted her chin slightly, met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor," she answered, "because I wasn't here to defend myself. I was here to protect two kids who didn't ask to be in this situation." He let that sit a moment, the silence in the room growing thick again, not with tension this time, but with recognition, like the collective breath of people who suddenly saw what they'd been missing. Daniela continued, not louder, not faster, but with the kind of clarity that doesn't waver even under fluorescent light. "They've had to prove their worth to adults their whole lives. I didn't want them to watch me do the same." The judge leaned forward, elbows on the desk, now his hands no longer fidgeting. "What do you believe they need most right now?" he asked, not rhetorically but genuinely, like a man seeking an answer from someone who had lived close to the truth. Daniela didn't need to think. "Stability," she said, "but not the kind that's painted over discomfort and called a home. They need someone who knows the weight of their silence, someone who doesn't flinch when the trauma surfaces in strange ways, someone who doesn't leave." The room was still. Even the bailiff didn't shift. Daniela's words didn't land like a closing argument, they settled more like a truth that had waited its turn. Judge Bainbridge nodded slowly, not as approval but acknowledgement. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he flipped to the final page of the file and read the last line of her supervisor's closing summary. "She doesn't wear the job. She carries it." And in that moment something changed, not loudly, not with fanfare, but deeply, like a room that had finally let in a draft of long-needed air. The judge closed the file gently and set his pen down beside it. No gavel, no declaration, just a pause long and full before he said softly, "Thank you, Miss Green." And for the first time that day, Daniela allowed herself to exhale. The light in the courtroom had shifted by the time Judge Bainbridge finally looked up from the thick file, the sun now casting long slanted bars across the benches, washing the room in that late afternoon hush when everything feels a little more fragile, a little more exposed. For a long moment he didn't speak, didn't reach for his gavel, didn't adjust his robe or posture. He simply sat there breathing in the quiet like it was the only truth he had left to hold on to. Across the room, Daniela remained still, her hands resting calmly on the edge of the table, her fingers lightly touching the folder she hadn't opened since she walked in. Devon sat behind her, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the judge with that quiet intensity only a child forced to grow up too early can maintain. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, not hesitant but stripped of the practiced polish that had once shielded him from doubt. "What we're here to decide today," he began, "is not just about legal eligibility or logistical capability. It's about who these children already trust and who has already earned the right to stay in their lives." His gaze moved slowly from Ellen Whitaker to Daniela Green, then settled briefly on Devon, whose jaw clenched just slightly, not in defiance, but in restrained hope. "I've read every page," Bainbridge continued. "I've considered every testimony, every placement report, every clinical note. And I've listened more than I usually do, perhaps because something in this room has asked more of me than law alone can answer." There was no movement from Valen now, no shifting of papers or whispered counsel. Even Ellen sat frozen, her composed expression slowly giving way to something more honest uncertainty. The air had thickened with something more than tension. It was the weight of truth pressing down, asking not just for a ruling but for accountability. Daniela didn't blink. She watched the judge not with anticipation but with a patience that came from years of waiting through harder silences than this one. She didn't know which way it would go, but she knew she had done everything she could with integrity. And sometimes that had to be enough. "Miss Green," the judge said, his voice returning to its formal register, "this court recognizes that you did not come here today seeking custody. But it is also clear from all accounts that your presence has been and continues to be the single most stabilizing factor in these children's lives." He paused, as if bracing himself for what came next, not out of doubt, but out of the solemn understanding that some decisions carry more than consequence, they carry history. "This court grants you emergency guardianship effective immediately, pending further review and support from Child Protective Services. The children will remain under your care in coordination with the department until a permanent resolution is formalized." The words didn't land with fanfare. There was no gasp from the gallery, no dramatic shift in body language. But inside Daniela something uncoiled, something she hadn't realized she'd been bracing so tightly against. She let out a quiet breath, deep and slow, and felt Devon's hand brush her back just for a second, like a child trying to say thank you without making it awkward. She turned slightly, gave him the smallest nod, then faced forward again with a dignity so still it almost hummed. Valen cleared his throat, stood halfway, then sat back down as if realizing that anything he might say now would only echo with the wrong kind of weight. Ellen reached for her purse, not angrily but with a kind of resignation that comes from realizing good intentions were never the same as being chosen. She didn't look at Daniela, didn't make a scene, just folded her hands and waited to be dismissed like a guest who had stayed too long at a gathering that wasn't meant for her. The judge gathered his papers, set them neatly in a pile, and looked back toward Daniela one last time. "You've earned more than the children's trust," he said quietly. "You've earned mine." Then, as if remembering he was still in a courtroom, he lifted the gavel, held it above the desk, and struck it once softly but clearly. "This hearing is adjourned." The sound echoed gently through the wood-paneled room, and just like that, the moment passed, not with thunder but with something deeper, a quiet recognition that the system for once had listened not just to rules, but to people. As the courtroom began to stir again, people rising, whispering, collecting their belongings, Daniela stood and turned to Devon, who was already on his feet, his arms stiff at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them now that the fight was momentarily over. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low. Devon nodded. "Yeah," he said. I didn't think they'd listen." Daniela managed a small smile. "Sometimes they don't," she said honestly. "But today they did. And that's what matters right now." They walked out of the courtroom together, not quickly, not triumphantly, but with the kind of quiet grace that comes only when something hard has ended without breaking you. The hallway outside was brighter than before, the light catching in the polished floor tiles, reflecting faint halos around their footsteps. People stepped aside as they passed, not rudely but with a kind of cautious respect, like they sensed something sacred had just moved through the space. And for the first time all day, no one asked Daniela to move. No one questioned why she was there. No one looked at her badge. They just let her walk still in the same clothes, still carrying the same tired bag, but now with the full weight of two children's trust behind her. And in that moment she knew she would carry it forward, however long it took, however heavy it became. Because some fights once begun don't end with a ruling. They begin again in the promise to stay. Outside the courtroom, the hallway had settled into a soft lull, the kind that follows a storm that didn't break into rain but still managed to change the sky. Daniela stood just beyond the heavy wooden doors, one hand resting on the cool steel rail, her fingers still curled, as if the echoes of the gavel were imprinted in her palm. Devon hovered beside her, silent now, his arms folded tight across his chest, not in defiance, but in that subtle self-protection kids carry when they've learned the world doesn't always wait for them to feel safe. The hum of the building, the soft clatter of heels, the dull squeak of a cart rolling across tile, seemed quieter now, almost respectful, like the building itself had overheard what took place in that room, and was choosing to stay still, little longer. Daniela turned to look at Devon, catching him in a moment of unreadable expression, the kind that lives in the space between relief and disbelief. His mouth moved slightly like he wanted to say something but hadn't decided whether words would make it stronger or weaker. "You did good in there," she said softly, her voice more breath than statement. He didn't answer right away. Then finally, "You think he meant it?" The judge. She nodded slowly, not with certainty, but with conviction. "I think he saw you. That's not nothing." Down the corridor, the elevator doors slid open with a muted ding, and a pair of attorneys stepped out, laughing quietly, about something that had nothing to do with the hearing they'd just left. Daniela watched them pass without much thought, then adjusted the strap on her worn leather bag. The weight of it, pressing into her shoulder like a reminder that nothing worth carrying was ever light. Behind them, Ellen Whitaker exited alone, her steps measured and graceful, but her face held the faint, unfamiliar lines of someone who'd just learned that being qualified doesn't always mean being chosen. Their eyes met briefly, Ellen's and Daniela's, not with animosity, but with something quieter, sadder. Daniela gave a small nod, polite but firm, the kind that says thank you for trying without suggesting regret. Ellen nodded back then, walked toward the elevators, her hand brushing the wall as she went steadying herself in a world that had subtly shifted beneath her feet. It was an exit without drama, but not without meaning. Devon leaned against the railing, his backpack hanging low from one shoulder, the zipper half open, exposing a crumpled snack wrapper and a spiral notebook with frayed corners. "So what now?" he asked, not looking up. Daniela hesitated, not because she didn't know, but because the question wasn't about logistics. Now she said carefully, "We go get your sister, make sure she's okay, and we start doing what we've always done. Keep going." He nodded once, then again, slower this time, and finally turned toward the staircase, his steps a little less heavy, like the floor might not cave beneath him anymore. Daniela followed her own pace, steady, her breath still catching now and then, like her body hadn't fully adjusted to what just happened. Not triumph, not victory, just a fragile stillness that might with care turn into something solid. As they reached the exit, the late afternoon sun slanted through the glass windows, casting golden lines across the tiled floor, the kind of light that softened even the hardest walls. Daniela paused in the doorway, one hand on the frame, her eyes adjusting to the brightness. She'd been inside for hours, but somehow it felt like she'd been holding her breath for years. Devon turned back and waited, not rushing her, just being there, a silent thread of trust between them. "Hey," he said almost too casually, "my sister. She's probably gonna want to hug you when she hears." Daniela let out a short laugh, not loud, not forced, just real. "I'll take it," she said, and the two of them stepped outside, together, the warmth of the air folding around them like a promise no one had dared to make before. They didn't say much on the way to the car. The quiet between them wasn't empty. It was full of things that didn't need explaining. As Daniela unlocked the door, she caught her reflection in the side mirror, tired eyes, creased sleeves, a faint stain on her jacket that no one had asked about but everyone had noticed. She didn't reach to fix anything. She simply got in, buckled her seatbelt, and started the engine. The drive to the shelter was uneventful, just the steady rhythm of tires against pavement, the occasional hum of traffic, and Devon flipping slowly through the pages of his notebook. "You ever get used to it?" he asked suddenly, not looking up. "Fighting like that, being the one nobody believes until they have to." Daniela thought for a long moment, then answered, "You don't get used to it, but you do get stronger. Not because it gets easier, but because the kids make it worth it." They pulled into the parking lot as the sun dipped lower, painting the shelter's entrance in gold and shadows. Daniela parked the car, turned the engine off, and looked over at him. "You ready?" He nodded this time, without hesitation, then stepped out and walked ahead, his frame small but steady against the amber glow. Inside, his sister was already waiting near the window, clutching a stuffed bear someone had donated last month, her face lighting up the second she saw them. She ran to the door before they'd even opened it fully, arms wide, eyes bright. "You're back," she yelled, wrapping herself around Daniela's waist without warning. Daniela knelt down, held her close, and whispered into her ear, "I told you I would be." And in that simple sentence, everything that had come before the courthouse, the silence, the judgment, faded just enough to make room for something new. Not perfect, not easy, but true. And in their world, that was more than enough to begin again. Weeks later, when the chaos had quieted and the court date was just another square on an old calendar pinned beside the fridge, Daniela found herself standing in the middle of her living room barefoot, holding a pair of worn-out shoes in one hand and a letter in the other. The letter had come from a small office in Washington, printed on thick paper, with an embossed seal that seemed too formal for the warmth in its words. It was from the National Museum of Social History, and it asked respectfully, and with great admiration, if she would consider donating the clothes she wore the day the children were placed in her care, as a symbol, the letter read, of everyday resilience and silent resistance in the face of public doubt. She stared at the page for a long time, not because she didn't know what it meant, but because she did. She looked down at the jacket, still hanging on the hook by the door, the sleeves still stiff with time, one of them marked faintly near the elbow with a coffee stain she'd stopped trying to scrub out weeks ago. The fabric was frayed at the edges, the seams pulled from wear, and the left pocket still carried the corner of a folded drawing. Devon's sister had slipped it in there, when no one was looking, a quick scrawl of "You saved us" in crayon, surrounded by uneven hearts. The shoes, well, they didn't look like much. One of them squeaked, the other leaned slightly inward from miles of hallways and sidewalks and late-night hospital visits. But standing there with that letter in her hand, and the quiet hum of the dishwasher in the background, Daniela realized something she hadn't fully felt. Until now, she had been seen not just by the children, but by the world outside the courtroom walls. Not with fanfare, not with headlines, but with recognition that came without strings. In the next room, the kids were sprawled out on the floor coloring with their shoes kicked off, talking in the half-quiet, half-excited rhythm of children who no longer had to wonder where they belonged. Devin was helping his sister spell out a new word forever, letter by letter, like it was something sacred. Daniela listened to them from the doorway for a minute, her hand resting on the frame, her heart unexpectedly full. The house was still a mess in the corners, laundry, not folded lunch dishes, waiting in the sink, but the center of it felt calm, like a place that had finally remembered what a home was supposed to be. Later that evening, she pulled out a small cardboard box from the closet, lined it with tissue paper, and laid the clothes inside, carefully smoothing the wrinkles like someone folding a flag. She paused over the jacket, reaching into the pocket to retrieve the crayon drawing, then hesitated and smiled to herself. She tucked the note right back where she found it. If they wanted to understand why those clothes mattered, they'd need to feel everything that had been carried in those pockets, too. The kids watched from the kitchen table, eyes wide with curiosity, and Devin finally asked, "Are you giving those away?" Daniela nodded slowly. "Yeah, they want to show people what it looks like to keep going even when it's hard." His sister tilted her head. "Are they going to hang your jacket in a museum?" Daniela laughed just once. "I guess so. Right next to old shoes and people who mattered." Devin looked thoughtful, then said, "You still matter even if you're not wearing it." She met his eyes, that soft certainty behind them, and replied, "Only because you two never stopped believing I did." Then, as if that had settled everything, they turned back to their coloring, as if heroism could be stored in boxes and still leave behind enough to make dinner and check homework and promise again to show up tomorrow. When the box was sealed and the shipping label printed, Daniela placed it by the door, where it sat like a quiet promise waiting to travel. She didn't rush to send it out. She let it stay there a while, let it become part of the house's rhythm, until it no longer felt like something she was giving away, but something she was allowing to speak. A few weeks later, visitors at the museum would stop before a glass case in the corner of a small exhibit titled "Invisible Strength," where a worn jacket and tired shoes would rest beside a typed placard. Worn by a social worker who refused to leave when leaving would have been easier, donated anonymously but recognized by many. Children on school field trips would press their noses to the glass whispering guesses about whose they were, and somewhere in the crowd a retired teacher or a tired mother or an old foster kid would pause just a little longer, eyes catching on the faint stain near the elbow, as if recognizing a version of their own story stitched into the thread. But Daniela never went to see the exhibit. She didn't need to. Her story was still unfolding in real time, in every scraped knee and late-night math problem and whispered secret from a child who now believed her presence was permanent. Her mornings were still filled with mismatched socks and school drop-offs, her nights with bedtime books and dim hallway lights left on just long enough to say, "I'm still here." And every time someone asked her how she kept doing it, how she stayed steady without applause, she'd just smile and say, "Because they don't need me to be perfect, they just need me to stay." And that more than any plaque or exhibit or courtroom win was the legacy she wanted to leave behind. Not that she was extraordinary, but that she chose again and again not to walk away. That in a world so quick to judge who someone is by what they wear, she had proven once and for all that love doesn't need to wear a suit, it just needs to show up. What this story reminds us in the most powerful and quiet way is that presence matters more than perfection. That showing up even when you're tired, misunderstood, or judged unfairly can change the course of someone's life. Daniela didn't wear a polished suit or speak with rehearsed authority. She showed up with heart, with grit, and with the kind of love that doesn't ask to be noticed. And in doing so, she reminded us all that being seen doesn't come from looking the part, it comes from living your truth. For those of us in our later years, we've seen the world favor appearances over substance far too often. But this story is proof that character, real character, isn't always loud. It's steady, it's kind. And it doesn't walk away when things get hard. It stays, it listens, it protects. So, if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your life who quietly made all the difference, or if it simply stirred something in your heart, don't let it end here. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who still believes in quiet heroes. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel where we honor real people, real stories, and the timeless values that still matter. Because sometimes all it takes is one story to remind us what truly counts. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there is still waiting to hear it.